The papers that surfaced in the winter of 1834 did not look dangerous. They were faded, bound in calfskin, and written in a steady feminine hand. But in those pages lay a story so precise in its cruelty, so deliberate in its unfolding, that even hardened men of politics and war sat pale and silent as the clerk read aloud the first lines. 00011724. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The case that would later be called the Ledger murders began, as such things often do, with an absence rather than an act. In the autumn of 1782, a woman arrived quietly in Richmond wearing mourning black and carrying a single trunk. She gave her name as Clara Whitmore, a widow of some modest means, whose husband, a merchant of British sympathies, had been executed as a traitor the year prior. No one questioned the story. Richmond was swollen with refugees, widows and ruined families in those years following the Revolution. Clara was polite, impeccably mannered, and apparently inconsolable. She rented a modest home on Grace Street and took no visitors. The neighbors spoke kindly of her restraint. Some pitied her isolation. No one wondered what she wrote by candlelight, hour after hour, in the thick bound ledger she kept locked in her writing desk. By the spring of 1783, the deaths began. At first there was no reason to suspect a pattern. Men died in those days as they always had, from fever, from accidents on muddy roads, from duels over debts or insults. But hindsight reconfigures the ordinary. It stitches together the fragments of chaos into a single unbroken thread. The first was Samuel Beach, a tobacco broker of some influence, found in his study, slumped over his accounts, dead of what the coroner called an apoplexy of sudden violence. His face was calm, his wine untouched. He was buried with honor. 2 weeks later, Elias Morton, a former quartermaster turned shipping agent, fell ill with a sickness that baffled his physician. Chills, spasms, a strange tightening of the jaw. He died within 2 days. His widow reported that his tea had tasted bitter the morning before his collapse. Then Thomas Avery, a respected banker, drowned in the canal, though he had neither reason nor apparent occasion to be near it. In each case, nothing pointed toward foul play, and yet the names, as we now know, were not chosen at random. Each man had belonged to a clandestine circle known privately among themselves as the Charter of Union, a group of wealthy speculators who had thrived during the Revolution by playing both sides of the conflict, ensuring profit, whether British or Patriot forces held sway. Clara Whitmore, whose true name was then unknown to all but a handful of buried records, had not come to Richmond to mourn. She had come to hunt. Her story, reconstructed through letters, depositions, and eventually her own coded confession, began years earlier in Williamsburg. Her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, was no innocent. He was, in fact, a minor operative for British intelligence, gathering supply data and troop movement rumors. But in 1779 he uncovered something larger, a conspiracy among 9 Virginian merchants to siphon military goods, sell intelligence, and manipulate wartime shortages for personal empire building. Jonathan made a fatal error. He attempted to blackmail them. The Charter of Union, fearing exposure, could not kill him outright without drawing suspicion. Instead, they betrayed him, furnishing fabricated proof of espionage to Patriot authorities. Jonathan was arrested, tried, and executed as a British spy. Clara, then heavy with child, fled the city under an assumed name. The stress of flight, hunger, and exposure led to the stillbirth of her only child in the woods outside Fredericksburg. In that dark hour, something in her broke, not the kind of break that collapses, but the kind that calcifies. She began to write. The ledger she carried to Richmond was no journal of grief. It was a plan: names, habits, vices, schedules, families, illnesses, servants, suppliers, weaknesses, and projected vulnerabilities of all 9 men who had conspired to destroy her life. By the time she entered Richmond society, Clara had remade herself with surgical precision. She claimed distant relation to a Massachusetts family whose line had gone quiet in the war, adopting their genealogy like a cloak. She secured letters of introduction from a sympathetic loyalist doctor who owed her late husband's father a debt of gratitude. She attended church with quiet regularity, offered charity to displaced widows, and gradually became an accepted, if somewhat somber fixture in the city's social orbit. But beneath the composed exterior, the machinery of revenge ticked on. Each move was calculated not merely for effect, but for deniability. No death must ever point toward her. No suspicion must ever gather in her shadow. The first three, Beach, Morton, Avery, were each method distinct, each perfectly timed to coincide with natural vulnerabilities. An old stroke risk, an experimental fever remedy, a late-night walk that would seem harmless until it was not. Each left Clara's name untouched. Each closed another page of her ledger. It was only after the fourth death, Robert Collingwood, a legislator, whose sudden collapse during debate sent a shiver through the house, that whispers began, not of Clara, never Clara, but of fate, of divine retribution, of some hidden rot in the city's most prominent men. The papers called it a season of tragedy among the mercantile class. Ministers spoke of providence, warning of judgment upon those whose wartime dealings had not been righteous. And still Clara wrote. Her entries from that period, painstakingly decoded by scholars in 1835, reveal not the gloating of a sadist, but the precision of a scientist. Dosage adjustments, behavioral triggers, predicted timelines, even emotional analysis of household staff to anticipate testimony should questions arise. A murder that leaves behind a murderer is poorly done, she wrote in one chilling passage. The ideal event must fold entirely into the fabric of chance. Only when the world itself accepts the death as proper does justice remain invisible. Clara's emergence from mourning, subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible, coincided with her increasing proximity to political figures. She hosted quiet dinners, introduced through mutual acquaintances as the widow Whitmore, whose sorrow has softened into grace. In those rooms, beneath the low light of candles, she listened more than she spoke, gathering the minor gossip of men who thought her harmless, a widow, childless, unthreatening. By 1785, 5 men of the original 9 were dead, 4 remained. But these final names were not merely merchants or agents. They were statesmen now, lawmakers, governors-in-waiting, men whose deaths could not occur without questions. Clara understood this. Her ledger shows the shift in her thinking, from isolated eliminations to orchestrated confrontations, deaths that must not only occur, but occur in ways that served a narrative, pointing not to her, but to each other. She no longer sought only revenge. She sought correction, the rewriting of history to punish the guilty and protect the innocent, herself foremost among them. The widow had become an architect. This is where the true story begins, where personal vengeance fuses with political consequence, where a grieving woman evolves into something history had not yet named, a strategist, whose weapon was patience, whose disguise was sorrow, and whose battlefield was the heart of a young nation, learning, painfully, how easily its ideals could be purchased, betrayed, and rewritten. Clara Whitmore's quiet arrival in Richmond would, in time, unravel an entire invisible government of corruption, and leave in its place nothing but ghost stories, sealed ledgers, and a lingering unanswerable question: had justice been done? The winter of 1785 found Richmond swollen, not with soldiers or refugees, but with ambition. The revolution had been won. The work of nation-building had begun. Merchants became legislators, speculators became governors, and the same hands that once trafficked in powder and uniforms now signed bills, shaping the young Commonwealth. Theros. She had buried 5 men without ceremony, each death unremarkable in its day, yet each excising a piece of the conspiracy that had taken her husband and child. What remained were the powerful ones, men no longer merely merchants, but architects of Virginia's political future. The remaining 4 were Josiah Fenton, now a delegate in the House of Burgesses, Stephen Harrow, treasurer of the Commonwealth, Matthew Lyle, a legal scholar with the ear of judges, and Governor Thomas Calvert, newly elevated, admired, untouchable. These were not men who died quiet. Any death among them would draw inquiry, political maneuvering, opportunists, eager to weaponize tragedy. Clara understood. The remaining work could no longer be performed by poison, by drowned canal, or sudden stroke. This phase required theatre. The first threads were drawn through Harrow, the treasurer, a man whose appetite for risk exceeded his grasp of secrecy. Harrow had risen swiftly, too swiftly, and carried with him the odor of unclean contract. Clara, with the patience of a historian, traced every ledger, every shipment, every piece of paper left behind in dusty clerk drawers. She discovered not merely evidence of wartime betrayal, but proof of peacetime embezzlement, debts buried under complex loans, missing funds disguised as clerical oversight. From there it was arithmetic. A single unsigned letter, drafted in a hand that imitated a restless clerk's, placed before a junior legislator eager for advancement, a whisper at the right supper table, a carefully folded document, dropped deliberately in the wrong sack. By spring, Harrow's name was murmured in corridors, as one who might soon retire for health. By midsummer, an audit appeared before him, not from Clara, not from any ally of hers, but from men who sensed weakness and opportunity. Harrow, cornered, began drinking heavily. His speeches grew erratic. The whispers turned into editorials. When Harrow was discovered in late August slumped in his carriage, pistol in hand, a single neat hole through his temple, Richmond sighed but did not question. Another casualty of ambition, another man broken by the weight of public disgrace. Clara's ledger received a thin line of ink through his name, but Harrow's death was more than removal. It was positioning. The scandal tainted his associates, scattered his allies, forced recalculations in corridors of power. Among those who spoke loudest against him was Josiah Fenton, whose own hands were not clean, but who now in self-preservation turned viciously on his former companion. Clara watched. She recorded. She waited. Her coded journals from that period reveal a mind not merely avenging, but curating history. To eliminate one man is to alter a path. To turn one path against another is to create a labyrinth no pursuer may solve. By leveraging Fenton's opportunistic attack on Harrow, Clara positioned him as the next fall, and crucially, one that would appear to fall by his own ambition. In October a pamphlet appeared in Williamsburg, unsigned, printed on cheap paper, seeded in taverns and law offices. It accused Josiah Fenton of trading favors during the war for British coin, a treasonous charge, but couched not as fact, as rumor. It was brilliant. It did not indict. It invited speculation. Clara had prepared it meticulously, mixing truths with falsehoods in proportions that made refutation impossible without self-incrimination. Fenton's enemies, and he had many, seized on it, each eager to polish his own loyalty by dimming Fenton's. By November, a formal inquiry threatened. Fenton raged in private, charmed in public, and drank in both. On a rainy night in December, returning from a fruitless attempt to sway a judge, Fenton's carriage slid on the river road. The horses panicked, the wheel shattered, and the vehicle overturned into a ravine. 3 days later, his body was pulled from the water. The coroner wrote of broken ribs, a drowned man, a tragic accident on treacherous winter roads. Clara's ink drew another line. 2 remained. By now whispers swirled not of conspiracy, but of bad fortune among Virginia's new elite. A merchant dead of stroke, a banker drowned, a treasurer ruined, a delegate lost to rain-slick roads. The kind of string that superstition clings to, but politics shrugs off. No one saw the hand guiding each event. Matthew Lyle posed a different challenge. A scholar of law, he held no treasury, commanded no militia, but his pen carried weight in judicial circles. He was an advisor, a shaper of arguments, a quiet force behind appointments. Lyle had never been careless. His vice was not greed or lust, but certainty, a belief that law, properly crafted, could control outcomes like a machine. Clara approached not with poison or rumor, but with philosophy. In surviving fragments of correspondence, some others found only as partial copies, appear letters between Lyle and an anonymous writer, a widow of sympathy and intelligence, who inquired about points of inheritance law, then matters of trade, then the morality of private justice in a corrupt state. The letters grew in length, in intimacy of tone, though never in confession. The widow wrote of sleepless nights, of questions about whether society could correct what law had failed to punish. Lyle replied in elegant abstractions, never guessing he was being led to a public precipice. In March of 1786, a series of those letters appeared, again anonymously, in a Richmond broadsheet,
carefully edited, arranged to suggest that Lyle had counseled a citizen in how to circumvent courts, perhaps even take justice by her own hand. It was not explicit, but in the fever of post-war politics, implication was often enough. Judges distanced themselves, petitions circulated. By May, Lyle withdrew from public counsel, citing in July he was discovered dead in his study, a fall from a high ladder while retrieving a heavy legal volume. His neck snapped cleanly. No suspicion was recorded. A scholar. Old injuries. A tragic misstep. Clara's ledger closed another page. Only Governor Thomas Calvert remained. And here, at last, revenge crossed the line into treason. Calvert was no merchant grown fat on war. He was a statesman, a war hero, a man whose charisma and connections placed him beyond ordinary reach. To kill him by hand, poison, accident or scandal would invite not just inquiry, but political convulsion. Clara understood that Calvert's death must not be murder, it must be history, a chain of events that, when complete, would leave no space for speculation, only inevitability. In her final notes of Part 2 of the ledger, decoded with difficulty by 19th century scholars, a chilling phrase appears in Latin: fiat ruina inter suos, let the ruin come from among his own. The widow had evolved from bereaved wife to clinical avenger, from clinical avenger to political saboteur. Now she would become something else entirely, an unseen author of self-consuming power, orchestrating a final act in which her enemy would not merely die but die by the architecture of his own alliances. The ledger's ink had grown darker. The theater was signed. History, though it did not yet know it, was about to be rewritten in bloodless, elegant catastrophe. Spring in Richmond carried with it a deceptive softness that streets that only a decade earlier had rattled with military wagons, now filled with gentlemen on horseback, clerks carrying rolled legislation, widows in black silk moving between shops that sold both mourning veils and imported tea. The city wore the costume of peace, but beneath it pulsed rivalry, factions jostling over tariffs, land surveys, debts owed to European creditors, and above all the fear that the fragile union of states could crack under the weight of too many powerful men pulling in opposite directions.
00214639 Our daughter Thomas Calvert at the heart of it was less a politician than a tactician. He had survived the revolution with his reputation untarnished, emerged from the article's chaos as a stabilizing figure, and courted both Federalists and Anti-Federalists with equal charm. He was, as one Philadelphia pamphlet wrote in 1785, a man trusted by all and therefore loyal to none. For Clara Whitmore, he was not merely the final name in her ledger, he was the keystone. Remove him improperly and the arch of revenge would collapse upon her. Remove him with precision, and the men who had orchestrated her husband's death would have no protector, no patron, no common spine. Clara had not lived by poison alone. She had learned to use what powerful men feared most, other powerful men. The first step was distance, not hers but his. Calvert's position was strongest when he stood above party fray. To bring him down, he had to be seen as leaning too far to one side. Letters began to circulate, subtle forgeries, written in an educated hand, bearing seals copied with wax and skill. These letters suggested Calvert had privately promised certain wealthy landowners tax leniencies in exchange for support of controversial navigation bills. The letters were not explosive, they were corrosive. They did not accuse him of treason, merely of preference, enough to unsettle his carefully neutral posture. By midsummer, the House of Burgesses buzzed with quiet speculation. Federalist delegates whispered of betrayal, Anti-Federalists muttered of opportunism. The very balance that kept Calvert untouchable began to tilt. Clara's second step was proximity. For years she had avoided the limelight of society, content to weave her web from shadowed parlors and borrowed names. But to finish this work, she needed a vantage within the governor's circle, not at its center but just outside it, close enough to observe, distant enough to avoid suspicion. An opportunity came through Eleanor Ashe, a widow of minor distinction who held weekly salons where trade policies and poetry mingled over Madeira. Clara, adopting the guise of a grieving sister seeking distraction from loss, began attending. She read little, spoke less, but listened with exquisite focus. Calvert himself never attended, Governors seldom did, but his aides did. His secretary, his political allies, even his nephew Henry Calvert, a young man whose romantic disarray was already a whispered amusement among Richmond's upper room. Through Eleanor's parlor, Clara learned of pressures no pamphlet could reveal, which votes were precarious, which debts private, which rumors believable, and more importantly, she learned of a quarrel, one not yet public, between Calvert and the influential Chamberlain family over military pensions. Clara did not invent this quarrel, she merely curated it. She found a former clerk of the pension office, paid modestly for memory, and seeded a conversation in a crowded tavern. A conversation loud enough to be overheard, but quiet enough to feel accidental. In it, the clerk lamented a payment discrepancy, blaming Calvert's office, hinting at intentional obstruction for political leverage. By week's end, 2 separate broadsheets carried editorial musings on whether the governor's loyalty to veterans was faltering. By month's end, Henry Calvert, careless, drunk, and eager to display indignation, wrote a heated letter defending his uncle, a letter that was intercepted, copied, and delivered to the Chamberlain family with selective lines underlined. Within days, the quarrel was no longer whispered, it was declared, and then with careful patience, Clara introduced the final instability, a financial panic traced not to the governor himself, but to a merchant syndicate that carried his informal endorsement. When shipments from the Indies were delayed by storms, and rumors of insolvency began, Clara fed the quiet panic with precise nudges, a doubted signature here, a questioned surety there, a subtle claim that Calvert had personally guaranteed debts he had merely witnessed. Merchants withdrew credit, creditors demanded gold. The panic did not become collapse, but it struck at precisely the image Calvert had cultivated: control, calm, inevitability. For the first time in years, Richmond saw its governor as vulnerable. And yet, Clara's genius was not in destruction. It was in plausibility. At no moment could a single finger point to a single hand. Each development, a quarrel, a rumor, a debt dispute, seemed born of politics, coincidence, even weather. The keystone was loosening, but gravity, not visible force, seemed to move it. The actual death, if death it may be called, remains one of the most perplexing in Virginia's political annals. Governor Thomas Calvert did not die in office, nor by bullet, nor by blade. He resigned on October 2, 1786, citing ill health of both body and confidence. Calvert issued a brief statement, stepping down in favor of an interim council. He left Richmond quietly that same week, retreating to a family estate near Yorktown. Within a fortnight, a fever claimed him. Physicians described it as sudden, relentless, but not suspicious. His body was buried with honors, but those who read the political temperature understood. The fever did not kill Calvert. Isolation, the moment he stepped out of Richmond's political circle, the moment alliances dissolved, his absence accelerated decisions, redistributions, opportunisms, and by the time his name was spoken again, it was not with reverence but with a note of pity. History wrote it as a natural past. Clara wrote it with a single horizontal stroke across a name. What no chronicle captured, but which the surviving Whitmore papers imply, is that Clara did not celebrate. She stopped. 8 names, 8 fates, none traceable, all inevitable. The Commonwealth had not merely punished her husband's killers, it had unknowingly ratified her revenge. The very politicians who benefited from these deaths had no idea they were finishing the work of a widow whose quiet fury had shaped a year of politics without ever once entering the chamber herself. Yet in the margins of her final ledger page, preserved in brittle paper now darkened with age, lies a single chilling annotation, written in her own hand, in the calm clerical script of a woman who had mastered patience, deception, and precision. Justice, when delayed, breeds not mercy but method, and method, perfected, need not end with one season. A line scholars have argued over for 2 centuries, whether it was a reflection, a warning, or a blueprint. Clara Whitmore vanished from Richmond records after 7. Some claim she remarried quietly and lived to old age in Maryland. Others suspect she fled, fearing the inevitable entropy of too many secrets. A few, those who've handled the Whitmore papers directly, suggest a more disturbing possibility, that her method became tradition, passed not by name, but by practice, woven into families, into councils, into the invisible hands that make men fall without ever knowing why. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia to mend what the Articles of Confederation had frayed, the air was not merely humid, it was charged. The country was a scaffold, half finished, straining under debts, jealousies, and the unquiet ghosts of war. Governors argued like merchants, merchants schemed like generals, and the idea of a nation hovered like a specter no one dared name too confident. Among the letters carried north in those months were several unsigned memoranda, each containing observations about Virginia's recent political upheavals. They were brief, dispassionate, almost clerical. 8 prominent men gone from influence in less than 3 years, each under circumstances of chance, illness, or scandal. The memoranda did not accuse, they merely list, but in a convention where power balanced on rumor, as much as law, even lists could become weight. Those who read them, Hamilton, Madison, Morris, remarked privately on Virginia's remarkable purges. No one spoke of murder, no one whispered of vengeance. Yet a question passed silently between them. If a single colony could so rapidly rearrange its power without war, without visible faction, without even open accusation, what exactly had rearranged it? In later centuries, the papers would be attributed to a nervous young delegate seeking to illustrate volatility in governance. But in the Whitmore archive, a single draft survives, a draft written in the same restrained, ink-steady hand as Clara's ledger. It bore no name, it bore no boast. It was merely titled, "For the consideration of men who build governance, as if they build ships. Know the waters move beneath you." From here the story begins to fracture, not in sequence but in certainty. Clara Whitmore disappears from tax rolls. After April of a woman answering her description appears briefly in Annapolis the following winter, purchasing a modest house under the name Margaret Bowen, then vanishes again. In Baltimore, a decade later, parish notes refer to a widowed Mrs. Bowen, who funded repairs to a school roof anonymous. But in 1802, in a sealed note discovered among the effects of Judge Aaron Trumbull of Maryland, appears a single unsettling confession. "I have been approached, discreetly, by a lady who seeks counsel not on law but on lineage. She asks whether inheritance can conceal true parentage, whether a name can hold 2 histories at once. Her bearing is refined, her knowledge unsettling. She speaks of justice as an inheritance, of debts unpaid by time. She gives no name, but I suspect her to be the architect of certain rebalances in Virginia, of which whispers still move beneath more recent scandals. I confess unease. There is method in her questions that suggests design beyond my reach. I have advised her only that paper is loyal to the hand that writes it, but ink is never truly dry. What began as revenge had by then acquired a quality almost theoretical, no longer tethered to grief, but to possibility. If a woman with no vote, no seat, no regiment could redraw the map of a state through patience, suggestion, and timing, what else might be moved? Could the scaffolding of power itself be tuned like an instrument, made to hem in frequencies chosen by one who understood both its tensions and its vanities? The Whitmore documents never answer this outright. They merely, a note in 1794, unsigned but authenticated by handwriting analysis, contains only a list: 2 senators, 1 bank president, a general, unseated quietly by health, a merchant prince, lost at sea though his ship had been inspected twice before leaving port. Below them a single underlined word: practice. By 1808, a pamphlet circulated anonymously in New York, later banned, titled, "On the Architecture of Influence." It argued, coldly, elegantly, that governance did not fall by coups or mobs, but by sequence, a chain of small displacements, so natural, so plausible, that by the time a structure collapses, no one remembers who loosened the first stone. Historians debate whether this was Clara's hand. The typography does not match Virginia presses. The idioms belong more to the mid-Atlantic elite, but phrases appear: "Justice delayed breeds method. Let ruin come from among its own," that echo Whitmore's private notes with uncomfortable clarity. If the story ended here, it would already be the most chilling quiet conspiracy of the young republic. But one final fragment anchors it not in legend, but in persistence. In 1821, a Massachusetts diary belonging to merchant Elias Penn records a dinner conversation with a widow of gentle age, precise speech, and uncommon serenity. Over dessert, as Penn fretted over a shipping monopoly strangling Boston trade, the widow reportedly smiled faintly and said, "A monopoly is a man with many arteries. You cannot sever them all at once. But if, over years, you convince each vessel it bleeds alone, the heart stops without a struggle." Penn recorded no name. He noted only, "I could not shake the sense that she was not advising me, but measuring whether I might, unwittingly, join an orchestra already playing. What is certain is this:
By the time Clara Whitmore's name vanished entirely from records, her method had outlived her grief. Whether as deliberate tradition, unconscious imitation, or mere accident of human cunning, the pattern recurred across decades: abrupt political absences, elegant scandals, collapses too orderly to be natural yet too natural to be conspiracies. Modern scholars remain divided. Some insist the Whitmore affair is a singular act of private vengeance that accidentally coincided with the turbulence of a young nation. Others argue that the nation itself, born of revolution, refined by secret committees, held together by fragile compromises, provided the perfect canopy under which designed misfortune could masquerade as history. A few, more unnervingly, suggest that Clara's final annotation method, perfected, need not end with one season, was neither reflection nor warning. It was instruction, and if so, then every generation since has lived, not above her story, but inside it. The ledger is closed, the ink is dry, the pages are brittle, but when handled under low light, one can still see faintly pressure marks where a quill pressed too firmly, as though the hand that wrote it carried both precision and weight. Weight not merely of grief, weight of By the early 1790s, America's public face was one of optimism, trade, and cautious invention, but beneath that sunlight ran dark, unmapped currents: debts, unpaid, privateers turned senators, former spies now merchants, men whose wartime improvisations had hardened into peacetime privilege. The Republic, barely alive, already carried fevers. It is in this fevered bloodstream that Clara Whitmore's trail reemerges, not as a widow in mourning, nor as a fugitive, but as an observer whose grief had distilled into something unnervingly disciplined. The earliest verified trace of her Baltimore years is a set of coded correspondences with a physician named Dr. Ezra Bell. These letters, preserved only in partial transcription by a clerk decades later, reveal a strange hybrid of medical inquiry and political reconnaissance. One begins: "Doctor, you have written that bodies, when improperly embalmed, can appear to die of ailments they never suffered. I ask, with equal caution, whether ideas might be embalmed in similar fashion, altered in record, so that later generations believe they were sick before they were slain. Suppose one wished not to remove a man but to remove the memory of what he had stood for, how much alteration of ledger, affidavit, testimony would suffice before his virtue seemed vice, his loyalty treason? Your opinion given privately may shape whether the scalpel I hold will cut at flesh, or merely at history." Dr. Bell's reply is lost, but a marginal note in Clara's surviving papers reads, "Yes, memory dies easiest when the wound appears self-inflicted." By 1792, a cluster of events in Maryland's mercantile elite drew quiet attention. A consortium funding a private canal collapsed when 3 of its 4 investors withdrew in the same fortnight, citing unexpected obligations elsewhere. A judge known for brokering discreet political loans resigned for ill health after his brother's sudden indictment on a forgery charge. A shipping magnate's insurance underwriters collectively refused to back his next fleet, forcing a humiliating public auction of half his assets. Each incident looked routine, regrettable, unconnected, yet internal correspondence now held at the Maryland Historical Society shows all 3 men had recently shared a single creditor, a discreet widow, operating under the name Margaret Bowen. Unlike her Virginia campaign, this phase left no bodies, at least no verifiable ones. It worked instead on veins, the delicate network of favors, debts, and assurances that sustained reputation and solvency. In a private essay found among her coded notebooks, Clara, now Bowen, wrote, "The artery may be cut, but bleeding alarms the room. Better the vein, slow, unseen, draining capacity, while leaving complexion untroubled until faintness arrives too late for remedy." Men imagine death only in violence. They do not suspect the peaceable suffocation of losing confidence, patronage, credit. A toppled man appears unlucky, never hunted. What had begun as vengeance was now technique, abstracted from its cause, refined by practice, and terrifyingly exportable. The Whitmore-Bowen method, if reconstructed from fragments, had 3 stages: isolation through credible misfortune, a target's networks fray not by attack, but by timing 3 unrelated inconveniences, arriving in a single season, each driving one more ally to safer ground. Inversion of virtue, letters, accounts, rumors, subtle enough to avoid direct libel, frame diligence as greed, prudence as cowardice, loyalty as opportunism. Nothing asserted, everything inferred. Self-authentication. The final blow comes never from outside. It comes as the target himself unwittingly provides the confirmation. A desperate loan, a sudden sale, a sharp remark misquoted. By the time ruin is visible, it appears organic. Evidence of this architecture surfaces again in 1794, when a congressional subcommittee quietly investigated why certain Maryland votes had shifted in patterns too synchronized to be coincidence. The inquiry concluded only that the state's commercial concerns have been unusually unsettled. No names were accused. No one noticed that a widow known for her generosity towards civic projects had relocated quietly to Boston 2 months prior. The Boston chapter is less documented, but no less unsettling. Shipping manifests place Margaret Bowen on correspondence terms with 2 publishers, a banker, and a professor of natural philosophy at Harvard. Within 3 years, all 4 men had exited their posts, one in scandal, one in bankruptcy, one to Europe in voluntary exile, one to an unmarked grave after a lingering digestive ailment, whose description matches symptoms of a toxin not formally identified until the late. If coincidence, it is a darkly articulate one, but the most chilling document from this era is a draft speech never delivered, found decades later hidden inside the spine of a disbound legal volume. It begins, "Gentlemen, you believe the republic secured by law. I submit it survives by choreography. Remove the dancers who strike the wrong note not by censure but by fatigue, by debt, by invitation to safer stages. Let no coup stain the floor. Let it instead gleam from polish too smooth for dissent to grip. You fear the mob. I fear boredom, for it is boredom that blinds while rearrangement takes place at arm's length. We need no daggers when belief itself may be retired quietly, with stipend and applause. Beneath the draft, a single note in Clara's hand, never delivered. The best performances are the ones no audience knows occurred. By the century's turn, Bowen's wealth had multiplied through discreet investments in banks and shipping lines, whose directors rarely realized they were collateral in experiments of influence. Letters from acquaintances describe her as reserved, charitable, unusually well-informed, often uncannily prescient about market shifts and political appointments. A Philadelphia merchant, writing to his brother in
The widow Bowen predicted last autumn which candidates would fail before even they suspected it. I took her counsel, I have profited, yet I confess a chill in her company. Not malice, not even arrogance, but a silence behind her eyes as if she watched architecture rather than conversation. At this point, her personal motive had dissolved entirely. No surviving writing laments Jonathan Whitmore. No oath of vengeance remains. What continues is the craft, iterated, perfected, anonymized. The Whitmore affair had proven something terrifying, that a single individual, with patience and comprehension of human vanity, could rewrite hierarchies without war, without election, without trace. What began as a widow's grief had matured into a manual on the bloodless anatomy of power, and by the time the nation noticed its internal rearrangements, if it noticed at all, the hand that drew the new maps was already elsewhere, invisible, calm, possibly seated across from you at supper. By the first years of the 19th century, Margaret Bowen was no longer a name in ledgers or even in gossip. She had become what only the rarest conspirators ever achieve, a vacancy mistaken for irrelevance. She attended no salons, she hosted no dinners. Even her philanthropy had acquired a ghostly discretion. Donations routed through intermediaries, funds arriving with no signature, influence exerted not as a request, but as an atmospheric correction, subtle and total. Yet evidence of her presence persisted in what later historians began to call the Providence Circle. In 1802, a boarding house on Benefit Street in Providence quietly accommodated a series of weekend literary gatherings. They appeared to passing neighbors no more suspicious than a reading society or theological club. Guests came in pairs or alone, most arriving after dusk, leaving before dawn. The minutes of their meetings, if any were kept, have not survived, but 3 separate memoirs from aging merchants and clerks decades later refer obliquely to those lessons on sequence, that study of consequence, and, most chillingly, the widow's diagrams. The diagrams appear once, in a surviving folio discovered in a private library, and they are not maps, they are not flowcharts, they are choreographies, arrows, names, and annotations arranged like dance notation, detailing how minor administrative delays cascade into political paralysis, how a single well-timed rumor hollows an institution's trust from within, how a man convinced he is acting in self-defense will remove himself from power without prompting. Across the top margin, in a script now authenticated as Clara Whitmore's, lies a single aphorism. A coup is an admission of failure. The art lies in making history rewrite itself while the actors believe they improvise. What Bowen had discovered by this stage was not merely how to remove obstacles. She had discovered how to teach removal, how to translate intuition into transferable testimony from merchant Caleb Proctor, preserved in a letter to his nephew in 1839, provides the clearest first-hand trace of the circle. She spoke without notes, never raising her voice. We were to imagine the Republic not as a fortification but as a stage set, painted with care, sturdy in appearance, but held up by frames and ropes like any other illusion. To alter the scene, one need not demolish, one need only shift the weight behind the curtain. She would assign us exercises, rearrange a parish by rumor alone, bankrupt a shipping firm without theft or violence, elevate a fool until his authority discredited what he touched. Each exercise, when traced backwards, left no culprit, no motive, only exhaustion and coincidence. By at least 6 documented commercial misfortunes in New England bore the hallmark sequence later identified as Whitmore method deployments. Withdrawal by credibility, key partners suddenly discover risk where none was before. Inversion by context, a man's greatest asset is framed. Liability exit by consent, the target believing he safeguards others removes himself. In each case, the paper trail exonerated everyone involved, and in each case the widow Bowen's name appeared only on peripheral, innocent transactions, a loan repaid on time, a property purchased at market rate, a polite letter of condolence. The circle's purpose remains debate. Was it a school for moral correction, a network of quiet reformers, intervening where the law failed? Or was it a rehearsal space for something colder, a generational project, to convert private vengeance into a civil engineering discipline of influence? The available clues offer neither comfort nor closure. One unsettling fragment written in Whitmore's cipher but decoded in the 1920s reads, "We have moved beyond vengeance. We now study equilibrium. The Republic, like any body, secretes rot. We excise without ceremony, without credit. The patient must never know the surgery occurred. Fame is infection. Anonymity is sterility. Our oath is not to each other, but to method. Method endures where bloodlines fail. It is here that the story crosses a threshold. The grieving widow has vanished. In her place stands an engineer of perception, a theorist whose fidelity is no longer to justice, nor even to fairness, but to the maintenance of a controllable system, one in which selected nodes may be removed, reputations inverted, hierarchies rearranged, all while the surface of society remains placid. If the circle dissolved, it did so silently. By 1810, no further traces appear. Members returned to commerce, clergy, minor politics. Some thrived, others disappeared in unremarkable retirement. But patterns, familiar patterns, began surfacing far beyond Providence. In Charleston, a shipping monopoly imploded with no provable sabotage. In Albany, a political faction fractured along lines too symmetrical for accident. In New Orleans, a land dispute resolved itself when both sides withdrew under identical, inexplicable financial strain. No letters connect these events, no names recur, but their geometry matches Providence diagrams with eerie precision. By the time Margaret Bowen, Clara Whitmore by birth, widow, fugitive, strategist, was herself withdrawing into age, her fingerprints had already been scrubbed from every ledge on which they once rested. Yet the machine she had designed, invisible, deniable, devastating, no longer required her hand. It required only someone's. An unsigned addendum discovered in the false bottom of a Providence writing desk reads, "Method is airless by design. It needs no blood, no creed, no inheritance. It migrates in whispers, in favors, in quiet proofs. Whoever holds it becomes its custodian only temporarily. It serves no person, no family. It serves sequence itself. I have made the world not safer but more delicate, and delicate worlds break without noise." By 1815, the Republic had matured into what history remembers as stability. Yet stability is merely movement slow enough to look like stillness, and the slowest movement of all is rearrangement no one perceives, until everything is already somewhere else. Whether Clara Whitmore still lived then, whether the widow Bowen watched from some discreet window as the country shifted on its hidden hinges, we cannot. What we can say from letters, from ledgers, from patterns that repeat like a refrain through unrelated decades, is this. A woman once used grief as a knife, then she discovered she could carve without drawing blood, and in doing so she wrote, or perhaps only revealed, the invisible curriculum of how nations can be edited from within while everyone believes they have authored their own undoing. When scholars much later attempted to catalogue the contents of what they came to call the Bowen Papers, they expected confession, or at least an index of crimes. What they found was something subtler, stranger, and infinitely more disquieting. It was not a diary, it was not a manifest, it was a codex, handwritten in multiple inks, amended by marginalia from at least 3 other hands. The pages were neither chronological nor personal, they were instructional. Among the first deciphered folios was a section labeled The Lesser Motion. It describes how to influence a parish election without ever attending a service, how to bankrupt a competitor without any fraudulent transaction, and how to turn one man's loyalty into another man's liabilities simply by altering what he overheard at the right hour. A later section, The Quiet Cascades, outlines the engineering of correction by inevitability, minor errors planted like seeds weeks or months before, each appearing innocent until their converging consequences force a decision, whose burden crushes the intended target without ever naming them. There are no proper nouns in these lessons, no victims, no cities, no dates, only symbols, a triangle where a council should be, a hollow circle where a merchant once stood, a dotted line where an inheritance might have passed. It is not a map of a conspiracy, it is the grammar of interference. One fragment, often quoted in hushed academic conferences even 2 centuries later, reads, "We are not to dominate. Domination invites resistance. Resistance reveals contest. Contest generates story, and story breeds suspicion. We are to erase so cleanly that even memory forgets a branch once grew where now the air is plain." The Bowen Papers were not found in Providence. They surfaced in Boston, in the locked drawer of a deceased shipping agent, whose estate contained no trace of any connection to Margaret Bowen, Clara Whitmore, or any member of the Providence Circle. They were discovered by chance in 1817 during the preparation of probate records. How they arrived there is still a matter of conjecture. Some argue Bowen entrusted them deliberately, dispersing her method like a seed packet rather than a torch to a single heir. Others suspect theft, or even replication, that by 1810, the method had already outgrown its architect. Moving along corridors of ambition, she neither sanctioned nor controlled. A chilling annotation believed to be in Bowen's hand appears at the edge of a page describing policy resculpture through clerical rotation. The craft no longer belongs to the wounded, it belongs to the willing. By 1820, the United States had entered what contemporary orators praised as a period of optimism and expansion. Yet behind the public speeches, certain correspondences tell of spontaneous alignments. A reform movement rising not from principle but from sequence. Judges retiring without scandal but always at the perfect legislative moment. Factions forming whose leaders later swore they never intended to lead anything at all. One merchant's widow in Baltimore writes to her sister, "It is as though the weather itself selects men for removal. They vanish not from shame, nor crime, nor plague but from a pressure none can name yet all of." The Codex also contained warnings, buried like footnotes in a sea of tactics. A system trained to adapt may devour its teacher. Patterns repeated too often acquire scent. If all hinges move, the door cannot remember its frame. Scholars have disagreed whether these are strategic caveats or confessions of fear. Margaret Bowen herself vanishes from record after 1812. The last verifiable trace is a notarized property sale, farmland, outside Hartford, signed with a hand already beginning to tremble. There is no burial record under her name or any alias previously linked to her, no obituary, no executor. Whether she died alone or was quietly folded into the very machinery she once designed, remains unanswerable, but her absence left no vacuum. By 1825, fragments of her technique were cited, unknowingly, in military treatises on morale disruption. In 1831, a political pamphlet in Philadelphia describes self-sorting ruin.
a phrase directly lifted from Bowen margin. By 1840, European dispatches mentioned the American precision in reshaping colonial administrations without overt revolt, a surgical rearrangement of power that leaves no martyr, no rebel, no origin. In a closed session of Congress in 1843, Representative Josiah Harlan of Pennsylvania allegedly remarked, "Gentlemen, the Republic has learned to bleed without wound. Whoever teaches this art is neither patriot nor traitor, but architect, and architecture neither mourns nor rejoices when the tenant dies." No transcript confirms this. Only a secretary's diary notes the quote, but it aligns with everything we know about what the Codex made possible. An unnamed analyst at Harvard's Historical Cryptology Department wrote, in a restricted internal paper in 1919, "If the Bowen papers are genuine, they constitute the earliest known attempt to distill soft power into repeatable context-free operation. They are less a conspiracy than a programming language for societies, substitutable variables, modular subroutines, scale-neutral outputs. They are not evil in themselves, they are simply indifferent, and therefore terrifying." And so by the late 19th century, a woman's private vengeance had become public infrastructure, not through proclamation, nor revolution, but through a leakage of logic, grief converted into method, method into practice, practice into inheritance invisible to blood, law, or ideology. To read the Bowen papers now, even in translation, is to feel the peculiar nausea of recognizing deliberate shape in what we once thought was accident. A final line, page torn but legible at its jagged edge, whispers, "When the system corrects itself with no author, perhaps the author was only ever the system." By mid-century, the United States had grown bold, restless and divided. Railroads carved steel corridors through untouched valleys, telegraphs carried urgency faster than horses could carry ink, cities swelled, and with them a new kind of politics, not merely local or legislative, but narrative-driven, susceptible to perception as much as principle. Within this fertile confusion, something invisible yet deliberate began to stir. It did not declare itself, nor even leave a signature, yet its fingerprints were everywhere, on laws that pivoted without debate, on partnerships dissolved with no public quarrel, on careers that seemed to fail from nothing but a sudden accumulation of invisible gravity. Historians would later call this era the silence market, a period in which influence was not purchased with coin, nor seized with force, but exchanged through calibrated absence, a vote uncast at the precise hour, a shipment delayed at exactly the wrong moment, witness who never quite arrived. The Bowen Codex, by now copied, translated, abridged, and even falsified, had leaked far beyond its Boston hiding place. No single person possessed all of it, but fragments now traveled, like smuggled scripture. Some pages guided commercial sabotage, others offered step-by-step diagrams for removing a judge without trial, using only the momentum of procedural trust. One section in particular, labeled Convergence Drift, became a blueprint for what later intelligence officers would recognize as plausible orchestration, the art of engineering coincidence so efficiently that no one could prove intention.
Letters discovered in a Philadelphia banker's private archive sealed for 50 years describe this new economy with startling frankness. "We have entered a period where power trades in silence. We buy not the act, but the hesitation that follows it. No signature, no seal, merely alignment, engineered as if by luck. A man who never suspects his decision was sculpted cannot fight the sculptor." Another, unsigned but attributed by handwriting to a known federal surveyor, notes, "We call them accidents, yet they lean too consistently in one direction. It is as if someone has taught fortune how to discriminate. The machinery of this invisible commerce proved lucrative. Fortunes rose not from invention but from timed vacancy. A competitor's warehouse burned, not by arson but by an insurance audit that froze inventory at the worst possible week. A senator's family scandal surfaced not because anyone leaked it, but because a sympathetic editor, pressured by subtle debts, withheld his routine silence. Every piece looked legal, every action defensible, the whole arrangement lethal. In 1851, an obscure legal brief circulated among a handful of Boston attorneys contains a single footnote whose provenance remains debated. Precedent is but inertia formalized. Alter inertia, and precedent will recite the new trajectory as if it were born sacred. Modern scholars agree that footnote mirrors a phrasing in the Bowen papers nearly word for word. The implications spread beyond commerce and politics. Churches split along invisible seams. Universities shifted curricula away from dangerous inquiries without ever admitting external influence. Even abolition, righteous, turbulent, unstoppable, was quietly delayed, not defeated by calendar interference so subtle that years later no one could say exactly why certain bills missed their procedural windows. It was never enough to stop history, only enough to throttle its timing, to starve momentum while feeding confusion. No single mastermind steered this architecture. That, ironically, was its greatest strength. The Codex had become less a secret and more a protocol. Anyone who understood it could apply it, and no one had to confess its existence. By the eve of the Civil War, certain generals would later remark privately that some battles seemed to begin already decided, not by strategy nor courage, but by the slow, invisible narrowing of options before either army even moved. When Reconstruction began, the silence market only deepened. Freedmen were granted rights by law, but their exercise of those rights was sanded down by calibrated obstacles. Clerks absent on crucial days, ballots printed with deliberate ambiguity, debts recalculated without fraud, yet always against the same citizen. "It is not oppression," wrote a New Orleans merchant in 1871. "It is gravity that favors the familiar and exhausts the brave." His phrasing, historians later realized, matched the Codex again. In 1878, a quiet congressional investigation, never published, its files later destroyed in a suspicious warehouse fire, allegedly concluded that a distributed method of nonviolent correction had infiltrated at least 6 states' bureaucratic process. The report did not name Margaret Bowen nor even acknowledge a human origin, but it warned, "We are governed not merely by laws but by the choreography of their inconvenience." By the dawn of the 20th century, the Codex had gone global. A German industrialist cited the American sequence in a memorandum on labor control. A British colonial officer referenced Bowen-style delay architecture during a private meeting on Indian rail expansion. In Moscow, a minister reportedly told an aide, half in jest, "Why hang a man when you can let his own schedule execute him?" Through all of it, Margaret Bowen herself remained a ghost, not a figure of worship, not even widely known by name, but the unnamed original fault line. What began as a widow's revenge had become a circulating algorithm, unowned, untraceable, devastating. By now even the myth had split. Some swore she died in poverty, others believed she lived long enough to regret what she had built. Watching as her meticulous designs meant to punish 9 guilty men became a set of tools for any ambition, any cruelty, any boredom that could afford patience. A forged obituary in 1854, discovered in a Providence archive, describes her as beloved, charitable, a friend to widows and orphans. Whether the forgery was to bury her twice or protect her once is unknown. Today, when intelligence historians chart the lineage of psychological operations, civil disruption and legislative sabotage, they do not start in the Cold War. They start in Providence, not with a conspiracy, but with a conversion. Pain into pattern, pattern into practice, practice into permanence. The silence market is not closed. It never was a market at all. It is simply the unpriced exchange of interference as inherent. And that may be the most haunting lesson of all, that the dead do not need to speak to continue influencing the living. They only need to have written clearly enough. By the final decade of the 19th century, the United States looked nothing like the fragile young republic Margaret Bowen had once moved through unseen. Railroads had become arteries, cities engines, and the federal government a sprawling nervous system of paperwork and patronage. Yet beneath the surface of this industrial pride, a series of invisible fractures persisted, not in machinery or masonry, but in decision itself. Court records from Cook County, sealed for nearly a century, and only recently declassified, show a clustering of verdicts in high-profile cases that confounded legal scholars even then. Each appeared lawful, each procedurally correct, and yet one after another they delivered outcomes that protected the already powerful, while exhausting any remaining appetite for reform. "We are governed by a choreography invisible to its dancers," wrote an anonymous law clerk. "Every step is chosen freely, yet somehow we always arrive at the same predetermined wall." Historians later coined the phrase, the Bowen drift, to describe this quiet convergence, not conspiracy in the traditional sense, but a cultural infection, decisions shaped by engineered coincidence, opportunities constrained by polite impossibility. The Bowen papers had never been published. They had no logo, no watermark, no single lineage of custodians, but they moved through law schools, corporate offices, the quiet backrooms of political machines, sometimes cited, more often paraphrased, always believed. By the 1890s, the Codex had been absorbed so thoroughly that no one needed to read it to apply it. Its logic had become instinct. A memorandum discovered in the private archive of industrialist Russell Dorr, dated February 1891, is one of the few surviving documents to reference the lineage explicitly. We operate now by invisible doctrine. It began by record, as vengeance, one widow's campaign to undo 9 men. It has evolved into a universal solvent for resistance. It is not crime, nor exactly governance. It is the erosion of possibility, controlled in dosage. Those who know how to adjust the flow need never announce their existence. What's chilling is not that corruption spread. Corruption had always been there. What's chilling is that by this period, the correction mechanisms themselves had been infiltrated. Whistleblowers found their careers collapsing, not from prosecution but from attrition. No opening here, no renewal there, a loan called early, a clerk who simply misplaced the right file at the wrong time. Patterns emerged in industries, supposedly insulated from politics. Meatpacking quotas fell exactly when new safety regulations loomed. Rail strikes failed not from force but from a sequence of minuscule clerical inconveniences that starved them of breath before they could ignite. In each case, no single hand could be blamed, and that was the perfection. An 1894 lecture at the University of Pennsylvania, later removed from the official archive, captured this eerie clarity in one single remark. A system built to prevent interference will fail not from attack, but from harmonized hesitation. When pressed, the lecturer declined to name his sources. Private letters between Chicago aldermen from 1895 show that even among those wielding influence, fear had returned. "There are no threats," wrote one, "only patterns, and patterns have no address you can raise." Another replied, in what may be the only surviving explicit Bowen reference of that decade, "I have seen the old Codex. It was never about the names of men, it was about furniture, the quiet rearrangement of rooms we think we still own." The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, a glittering triumph of American engineering, also became, quietly, a demonstration platform. Decisions about contracts, labor routes, even exhibit placements, were adjusted midstream, with surgical subtle. Competing firms, bankrupted, not by sabotage but by dead-end timing they never saw coming. Later audits found nothing actionable. Only one phrase recurred in private correspondence: "It was already decided before the vote." By 1898, a quiet counter-movement began forming among a small group of jurists and newspaper editors who suspected, without proof, that something was pressing history from underneath. They called themselves the Honest Error Society, a name chosen to disguise purpose behind irony. Their notes, most lost, a few surviving in marginalia, suggest an unsettling conclusion: we cannot correct what we cannot isolate. The infection has no core. Every participant is voluntary, every choice justified, every coincidence excusable. The doctrine survives precisely because it has outgrown intention. One letter, unsigned but believed to be written by a young Ida Tarbell before her rise to fame, ends with a line historians still cite with unease: "We do not battle a conspiracy. We live in an atmosphere engineered by the dead." Modern intelligence scholars who study influence networks, both state and criminal, now treat the Bowen Codex, not as a singular text, but as the first transferable operating system for systemic manipulation. It was never merely about revenge. It became a grammar for bending social machinery without breaking it. Once that grammar existed, anyone who spoke it fluently could rewrite consequence itself. And by the turn of the century, it no longer mattered whether Margaret Bowen had lived, died, or even ever truly existed. The pattern no longer needed its author. It had become the author. That is perhaps the most disturbing revelation in the surviving testimonies, that what began as personal justice, cruel but comprehensible, had evolved into something autonomous, a drift, a quiet pressure, no longer tied to morality, revenge, or even profit, just moment. By the spring of 1912, the ocean liners grew taller, the cities louder, and the engines more confident. But in one small reading room of the Rhode Island Historical Society, a clerk sorting an unlabeled trunk found a stack of papers written in a hand, both precise and strangely detached. No name adorned the cover,
No seal declared ownership, but within a week the archivists understood they had found something that should not exist. The papers were not memoir, nor confession, they were instruction. The Providence Ledger, as it came to be known in whispers, offered step-by-step descriptions for manipulating inheritance courts, delaying legislative bills without detection, neutralizing whistleblowers through orchestrated fatigue, and eroding public trust without ever once deploying a lie. The archivists argued in circles. Was it an authentic artifact from Margaret Bowen herself, her last insurance against oblivion, or a later copy, built from oral fragments, adjusted to suit a new century's ambitions? No answer satisfied. Every theory carried its own implausibility. A letter from the Society's director to a private law firm in Boston, marked "Destroy after reading," summarizes the dilemma. If we preserve it, we legitimize it. If we destroy it, we guarantee its myth. We are holding not a weapon but a template. It does not tell one what to want. It tells one how to get what one wants, without appearing to move at all. Within a month, the ledger was gone. No record confirms where. Some claim it was burned. Others, that it was purchased quietly and never returned. A few insist it remains in the Society's basement, misfiled under colonial shipping receipts. But the pattern did not wait for certainty. Within the next 3 decades, historians would document a series of political collapses, corporate wars, and public crises, whose anomalous smoothness carried the same Bowen fingerprints, timing that seemed too perfect for coincidence, too lawful for conspiracy. A tariff repeal introduced exactly 3 hours before a senator's son was indicted. A shipyard strike resolved with no casualties but all the wrong men promoted. A judicial confirmation delayed by the flu, except that the senator who carried the deciding vote had received no visitors except one, unregistered, carrying no surname, no fee. When the Great War finally dragged the United States across the Atlantic, no secret council of Margaret Bowen's descendants steered policy. Yet, as military historians would later admit off record, several supply chains bent around improbable gaps, and entire regiments found themselves reassigned through clerical sequences that seemed to favor certain industries, without naming them. It was not sabotage, wrote a quartermaster in 1918. It was arithmetic tilted slightly downhill, and every marble rolled the same direction. By mid-century, even intelligence agencies, tasked with protecting democratic stability, conceded privately that they could not untangle which of their own crises were organic and which were simply well-timed gravity. A memo declassified only in 1998 contains the following chilling summary: there is no network, there is no command, there is only method. Those who discover it believe they've inherited a lineage. What they've actually inherited is the illusion that lineage still matters. And there finally, the human tragedy of Margaret Bowen's creation reveals its last stage: irrelevance. She had weaponized patience, turned grief into machinery, and machinery into inheritance. But by the time the 20th century matured, no one needed her name, her reasons, or even her memory. The codex no longer required an author. The revenge had long since burned away. What remained was structure, and structure, like gravity, does not apologize. The ledger, whether real, forged, or reassembled from fragments, is now cited only in footnotes that warn more than they inform. Intelligent scholars teach it as an ethical parable, that once you teach a system how to lie without speaking, the lie will walk on its own, across borders, across centuries, until no one remembers that it was born of heartbreak and fury. In the dim light of the reading room where the trunk was opened, one archivist reportedly whispered, half to himself, "It is not haunted, it is worse, it is obedient." Today, if you scan the obituaries of quiet cities, the bankruptcy filings of rising firms, the procedural logs of failed reform bills, you can still find the rhythm: delays no one ordered, alliances no one claimed, silences perfectly timed to kill momentum without drawing blood. No conspiracy, no villain, no cult, just a grammar left behind by a woman whose name now serves mostly as a rumor: Margaret Bowen, a widow who never sought power, only balance, and in seeking it, tilted the entire table forever. When we speak of justice, we comfort ourselves by believing it requires motion, judges, juries, laws, verdicts. Margaret Bowen proved the opposite, that the deadliest justice is immobile, a gravity of decisions, invisible yet irreversible. Perhaps somewhere in Providence, a file drawer still holds her final ledger. Perhaps it has been reduced to ash. Perhaps it never existed at all, And the pattern we follow is simply how human weakness harmonizes. When given room to sing, we may never, but if, in your lifetime, you watch a righteous cause dissolve not from attack but from silence, if you see brave men and women lose without ever once being out-argued, remember this story. Do not look for hands, look for the timing, and pray it is not Bowen's time.